everyone. Parul Srivastava here from the 1947 Partition Archive. Welcome to the third season of Sunday Stories Live, brought to you by the 1947 Partition Archive. It's a global non-profit, non-governmental organization that works tirelessly to preserve the nearly lost oral histories of partition. I'm excited to be hosting this season. As I said, this is the third season of Sunday Stories. The first season was hosted by Noor Anand Chawla. The second one was hosted by Sonam Kalra, and I will be your MC for the event today. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to this episode where we will be conversing with a rising historian, Dr. Radha Kapuria. Her work focuses on cultural studies and ethnomusicology. Hi, Radha, welcome.
Hi,
Uh,
Parul.
so as the name suggests, this event series will be taking place every Sunday. So please be sure to join us. If you wish to watch any episode from the last two seasons, they are available on our Facebook and YouTube page under the video section. Sunday Stories is a series that will bring to you academics, scholars, oral historians, and people's personal stories of the partition. This season's theme is understanding partition through memory studies. So let me just begin by telling you a bit about Radha. Radha Kapuria is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the Department of History at the University of Sheffield. Her PhD was conducted at King's College London on a Commonwealth scholarship, and she was shortlisted for the Royal Asiatic Society's Bailey Prize 2019. Her work straddles history, cultural studies, and ethnomusicology, and her book manuscript, A Social History of Music in Punjab, from Pul Kanjri to Patiala, will soon be published with Oxford University Press. That's amazing. Uh, Her research has won multiple awards and appeared in books and journals. Dr. Kapuria's deep rooted family ties in West Punjab, which is currently Pakistan, allowed her to explore her cultural heritage through a personal lens. Okay, so let's welcome her. We will now be having a conversation with, Radha about her experiences, in conducting history, in conducting oral histories. Um, so do you want to say anything to our audience before we just dive into the questions, Radha?
No, thanks for having me, Parul. It's really nice to be invited to this and to talk about this various aspects of partition. So it's a really great series. Looking forward.
Thank you so much for coming on to our show. So we'll just begin
Yeah.
with the first question. So I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about your personal connection with partition, and how did you what drove you to to this research?
Well, so I think my personal connection is what drove me to the research. I come from a family that is entirely affected by partition. Both sets of grandparents, like so from my mother's side and my father's side, they all came to the Indian side of the border in 1947. So all my grandparents were born in Pakistan. My nani was born in Sargoda, my nana in Khushab, which is near Lahore. And my dada was in Lailpur, which is now Faisalabad, and my dadi is from Gujranwala. So all of them kind of had connections to the city of Lahore as well. And I grew up in Delhi. So my Nana's family came to Mumbai, Bombay, and my Dada's family to Delhi. So my entire history is in these cities, and yet there was always this sense of uh, wondering where we came from and wondering this about this history of partition and how it impacted us. As a grandchild of the partition, what what was the resonance? So that drew me to it. And my nani used to write songs and bhajans, so she was
Wow.
like she was very musically gifted, so she used to uh, compose her own songs, and she was quite musical. And obviously we grew up in Punjabi weddings listening to all these songs on the dholki and the tappe. So I was very intrigued by this music, and the fact that the songs we listened to often came in cassettes which were from Pakistan or of Pakistani artists like Musarrat. So, that's exactly how I got excited about this subject.
Okay. That's wonderful. So were you able to sort of record your nani's songs? Do you have the recordings of those?
We have, unfortunately, she passed away when I was very young. So
Oh,
we don't have recordings of her singing, but we have, like, we've noted down, we've converted the oral into the written. And so my mum and her sisters and my aunts, they've got them written down and printed. So we have the text of her songs and we remember the tunes, but I think we will have to record the melodies soon.
yeah,
Otherwise, that will sort of die out.
yeah. It's wonderful, at least you have it documented somewhere. So that's great. You can always build up on that.
Yeah.
Um, so I also wish to just remind our audience to ask questions, to keep posting your questions in the comment section, during the course of the conversation. Um, okay, so moving on to another, thing that came to my mind about oral histories. I think you've done a lot of oral history interviews, right?
Yeah.
Because you have a lot of experience doing that, it would be wonderful if you could just share some anecdotes from your experience of collecting oral histories with us. And if
Yeah.
you found something that's, very distinct, I think our audience would love to hear that.
Right. There's, I think before I sort of share my screen and show you a few slides about the little bit I have discovered so far, because and still a lot more needs to be researched and discovered. COVID has meant that the research has slowed down a bit.
Yeah.
But I think with music and musicians in South Asia, you have to rely on oral history and interviews. You cannot do research without interviews and oral history. So let me just share my screen and let's hope this works.
Yeah.
Uh, can you see my screen, Parul?
Not right. Oh, yeah, we can. We can.
Oh,
Yes.
lovely.
Wow.
Okay, so that's just a sort of set of images of Punjabi musicians. And well, the musician here is not Punjabi, Roshnara Begum, but she settled in Punjab after partition. But it's a very interesting legacy of musicians who were divided by partition, but they kept also traveling across the borders through the 50s and 60s, some of them. And Madam Noor Jahan, who is the image on the top left, came in the 80s to India. So there's a very
Mhm.
interesting history of how the borders were questioned by these musicians as well. But I will start with the story of some of these people I have interviewed in the UK because I'm based here right now. And these are all men who have an interest in music. They are scholars of music. They themselves write about it, and they are all from different parts of South Asia. So the one in the center, unfortunately, has passed away, Firdaus Ali. He was from Kashmir and not from Punjab, but he introduced me to these two gentlemen who are on
Oh,
the two sides of the screen. So Sardar Balbir Singh Kanwal, who is from Hoshiarpur originally in East Punjab, and the other gentleman is from Gujranwala in West Punjab, Mr. Muhammad Ayub Aulia. And they all have a common interest in music. They're all friends here in the UK. And I want to talk about Ayub Aulia's father-in-law, who was Ustad Allah Rakha, the famous tabla player, tabla Ustad, and the father of Ustad Zakir Hussain. And Allah Rakha Saab was a very talented musician. He also composed music for films in the 1950s. And he composed the music for a film called Madari.
okay.
It so turned out that the soundtrack of Madari had perished in the fires in the Bombay Film Archives. So Madari was a 1950 Punjabi film, 3 years after partition, and no one could find the soundtrack. Ustad Allah Rakha could not find the soundtrack himself for a music, for a film. He gave the music to himself. Then they searched everywhere. They even searched in Pakistan because this was a Punjabi film. It was popular across the border.
Yeah.
Eventually, they found the film in Southall in London, and this was thanks to Firdaus Ali, who is this
Oh,
gentleman center. So Firdaus Ali helped to locate the soundtrack. Now, today it is available on YouTube. So I'll quickly play a clip from a song.
Sure.
गल जेड़े सन लखपति अज पल्ले कोई नी थेला गल जेड़े सन लखपति अज पल्ले कोई नी थेला विच किताबां लिखिया दुनिया चार दिना दा मेला विच किताबां लिखिया दुनिया चार दिना दा मेला मैं कोई झूठ बोलिया मैं कोई कुफर बोलिया बस फिर जफ्फियां पालो आजादी दे गुन गालो
So this is supposedly a very fun-loving song. The melody is very carefree. It's a Punjabi folk tune, but they're actually it's a satire of freedom. You know,
Yeah.
they say let's sing the praises of freedom, even though we have no money left. It's almost sarcastic, and there's also humor there. So
Yes.
it, I think it's showing us how people in the immediate aftermath of partition were. Understanding and dealing with this new life which they were trying to build.
Yeah.
So that's one of the examples that came out from oral interviews with these people, um, which is a very interesting story of how this soundtrack was located in South Hall and then sent back to Bombay, where Ustad Allah Rakha was. So it kind of traversed across the world. So yeah, that's the story of uh, uh, oral interviews. There is so much in terms of interviews that have already been conducted of musicians, which are there in the memoirs, in the writings of people who've written on musicians. But no one has actually kind of tried to understand what partition meant for these musicians, apart from a very few people. So yeah.
I think it's commendable that you were able to sort of, like locate this song, which was otherwise lost, right? Yeah. So that's amazing. That's wonderful, actually. So, for those of you who are just joining, you're watching Sunday Stories live from the 1947 Partition Archive. This is season 3, and Dr. Radha Kapuria is our guest, and my name is Parul Srivastava. Um, Great. So, Radha, I think we'll move on to the question of archives now, because your book is about to, come up. So, of course, you would have consulted the archives for that. So, if, like our young researchers, if somebody is looking forward to sort of doing some research related to ignored communities, how do they approach the archives?
Right. So I'll just briefly mention my book because the slide is here referring to colonial Punjab.
Hmm.
So looking at undivided Punjab, and that's what my research for my PhD, which is now going to be this book, looks into, which is the musical histories of undivided Punjab, looking at the period from Maharaja Ranjit Singh, which is this map here. The orange section is Ranjit Singh's sort of empire. And there you can see the modern day borders between Pakistan and India. And here is another sort of map of the Ranjit Singh kind of Punjab. And the one on the left is Punjab in 1911, so under British rule. But the main thing I'm looking at in this book is the history of people like the courtesans, the tawaifs, and the mirasis, who are the community who perform music in Punjab and who are traditionally assigned lower caste status and looked down upon, and they are the butt of jokes and they are ridiculed by people from the upper castes. And this is because they inspire fear, because Mirasis hold the stories, the genealogies of families. So they have knowledge and they use humor and satire to also speak truth to power. So, and yet these are illiterate groups, they are marginalized. So it's very hard to find them in the archives or find their voices. So I think they were represented by others. the Mirasis or the courtesans were often represented by, say, British colonial scholar administrators like Richard Temple, who collected folk tales, which the Mirasis told him, yet he didn't. He rarely gave us the names of these Mirasis. So it's a very tricky business to look for these figures in the archives, but we can find traces to their life, to their existence. And the other people who wrote about these communities were the middle class Punjabis, the anglicized people who were English educated and who wanted to reform or change Punjabi musical culture in a way that seemed to be more modern. But in trying to do that, they excluded these communities. So in trying to make music more appealing to the middle classes and to get middle class women to start singing, they did that by demonizing the traditional practitioners of music. So in that sense, that's the legacy that kind of story is there in my book. But yeah, that's just a rough kind of a very small glimpse into the
Yeah.
book. Yeah.
Okay. This is amazing, like, how you mentioned about the Mirasi community. And I was just thinking that do we find the Mirasi community on the, Punjab on the in the Indian side?
Yes, we do. We have there is a greater uh, population or greater number of Mirasis in the Punjab, in the Pakistani side of Punjab, but there we definitely do have Mirasis in Indian Punjab as well. Um, so, for example, the Noora sisters, the great
Oh,
granddaughters of Bibi Noora,
yeah,
they
yeah.
they proudly proclaim their Mirasi heritage, but also their classical music training in the Sham Chaurasi Gharana of classical music. And that's the other point that I also make in my book, which is that the Mirasis were also, they also were inheritors of the classical music knowledge as well, because they may not know the exact terms, but they, through the oral tradition, they were able to they were able to sing these alaps, and they knew about rag, the basic knowledge of rag music they had. So the Mirasis, they're seen as folk musicians, but they also had the classical tradition very strongly embedded in them. So yes, we do have Mirasis on both sides of the border, and yeah,
Okay, because I remember a few years back, I was watching this Pakistani show called Udari,
right.
and in that, I first came across the Mirasi community, and how, along with a lot of other, along with women of other communities, how the Mirasi women were also fighting, society, traditions, taboos, and norms, and all of that. So I was just wondering if we have Mirasis on the Indian side as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, we do. And to refer back to your question about archives and oral history,
yeah,
this slide here is kind of, it shows you how, for histories of music, you find traces while doing interviews and field work. So the image on the right is from Jalandhar in 2011 when I was doing some research there. It's of an old harmonium dealer called Gyan Singh from Kot Kishan Chand. And some 100 years before that, in the newspaper The Tribune from Lahore, we have the ad for Sadhu Singh harmonium manufacturer, which is on the left. So it's this kind of interplay between archives and between fieldwork or interviews, which through which we get a sense of the history of music.
yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so the audience, please do not forget to post your questions in the comment section. We would be moving to the Q&A section in about 10 minutes from now, 10 to 15 minutes. So yeah. Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
I just wanted to share another example of looking at the archives for examples of music,
Yeah.
and the newspapers are a great archival resource for any of us who are looking for these things like music, which are not seen as proper, solid political history. The Pakistan Times from September 1950, for example, shows us how Janamashtami was celebrated in Lahore in 1950, which is like more than 3 years after partition, and it was celebrated with sitar being played and with harmonium, so in a classical musical setting. So it's really interesting to find these examples in the archives, and some of these things we may not find in interviews is the interesting bit as well. So
Yeah, yeah. This is fascinating that, like, because in this kind of documentation, I think you can only find in newspapers, like you said.
yes,
Like,
yes.
yeah.
But I think I'd like to refer to your question of interviews because we'll soon move on to Q&A. And I'd like to thank the 1947 Partition Archive because their interviews have helped me as well because they have interviewed some musicians who are not well known. The musician you see on the screen here is one of the most well known classical musicians
Yeah,
of Punjab, Ustad Bade Ghulam Ali Khan,
of course.
and he moved from Pakistan to India 10 years after partition. So for 10 years, he was a Pakistani citizen. Uh, and that's because his hometown was in Pakistan. So he moved back home to Kasur, which is near Lahore. But Morarji Desai, who was interested in music, offered to Ustad Bade Ghulam Ali Khan that please come to India, we will give you a lot more sort of opportunities as a performer. So he migrated and then he died 10 years, 11 years later in 1968. So he's a curious case of someone who was both a Pakistani citizen for 10 years and then an Indian citizen. And of
Yeah.
course, before that, he was neither. He was just a Punjabi musician before that. And going back to the partition archive, um, uh, there is Vilayat Khan, whom your archive has interviewed, who
Hmm.
migrated from Ludhiana in Indian Punjab to Sargoda in West Punjab, and then he as well came back to Indian Punjab. So he is a lesser known musician, but he kind of shows us the opposite story. He returned back to India because he was pining for his home. So he came back for personal reasons, whereas Ustad Bade Ghulam Ali Khan moved for professional reasons. So, even after partition, even after 1947, these movements kept happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I was doing, like interviews in Lucknow, in Kanpur, I
Yeah.
also came across a woman. Like, she wasn't a musician, but then she, along with her sisters and her father, they had all migrated to Karachi. This was the time, around the time when Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated. But then after a year of living over there, they were pining for home, pining for their like lost land and business, because they did not know how to sort of build life in a new country.
Yeah.
So they came back, but in the meantime, I remember she told me her mother had passed away. So her mother's, like grave, it's in Pakistan now, and two of her sisters, they got married in Pakistan,
Yeah.
and the rest of the family came back to India.
This,
And
this
it's
is
it
an interesting story about how families continue to be divided across borders.
exactly. She's like, the last time I saw my sister was in 1980s, when like it was fairly easy to sort of cross border and reach the other side, but then since that time they've only been having video calls.
Yeah, I can imagine. And this sense of crossing borders, I just wanted to quickly show this map that we have created with the experts at Sheffield. This is a very preliminary map. I still have to add more data to this, but it shows you the cities from where people migrated, musicians, not people, musicians migrated. So, and the thickness of the arrow shows you the numbers of musicians. So Amritsar and Patiala, perhaps the largest number of musicians went from these cities to Lahore. And so, I mean, and it's really interesting how that happened. And what we forget is that there were lots of musical festivals which continued happening on both sides of the border, which invited musicians from, say, Pakistan to India, from India to Pakistan. And one example of this is Mr. Raza Kazim, who is in Lahore and whom I happened to meet in 2019. He was quite old then. And he used to he has a musical institute there, and he has been hosting a musical festival where he invites people from India. But I think since 2017 it has stopped. So again, he was lamenting the fact that this is now no longer as easy as it used to
Yeah.
be. And
Yeah.
those who are interested should definitely watch Yusuf, who is a friend in Delhi, a very good filmmaker. He made this wonderful film called Khayal Darpan, where you have an interview of Raza Kazim, which is worth watching. So I would recommend that very much.
Yeah. This is actually a great source, I think, for people who are really interested in. Um, so I think maybe after our conversation, if possible, you can just post the link of this, YouTube documentary in the comment section of the interview so that
Of
people can have easy access to that.
I'll do that.
Yeah.
And this is the Indian counterpart of Raza Kazim, Ashwini Kumar, who was a policeman and who used to host the Harvallabh Music Festival in Jalandhar. And he told me in an interview of how he got Roshanara Begum to come and perform at Jalandhar, despite all kinds of problems. So these are the people who kept this culture alive of going beyond national borders, of remembering the pre 1947 musical world, musical culture. So they tried to keep it alive. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing to like hear these like stories from you firsthand, um, you know because of your interviews and everything. So could you also shed some light on how partition has impacted the music of India and Pakistan, as you came across during like researching for your book?
Yeah. So the question of how partition impacted India and Pakistan is something I'm researching right now for my Lever Hume project.
Okay.
My book was on the pre-partition history, so it's pre 1947, pre India
Okay.
and Pakistan as we know them today.
Mm-hmm.
I think others like Yusuf and other scholars like Virinder Kalra, Malik Saeed, others have looked at both countries. And the main trends that we see is that in India, Indian Punjab, after partition, there was a greater emphasis on folk music. So Punjab was defined as a land of folk, folk culture, folk music, and that's what gained precedence. That's what was funded by government as well, Sangeet Natak Academy, etc. In Pakistan, on the other hand, there was a greater emphasis on Qawwali and Ghazal. So that became Sufi music, kind of became definitive of Punjabi music in Pakistan. As a result, in both countries, what was lost out was this idea of classical music and this idea that uh, you know that Punjab can be associated with classical music,
Yeah.
despite the fact that we have so many classical music lineages. So I think the fact that Punjabis have, in some ways, forgotten the tag of classical music as part of their culture is also an impact of partition. And as opposed to people will associate Bengal or Maharashtra with strong classical traditions in India, or even Lucknow and as the former Nawabs. But with Punjab, that memory seems to have dimmed. The
Yeah.
only people who remember are music lovers or the musicians themselves. But in the popular sort of realm, we have forgotten. And I think that's due to partition.
Yeah. um I think you mentioned that you interviewed, I'm forgetting the name. Was it Raza Kazmi in Lahore,
Raza Kazim, yes.
right? So did you go to Pakistan to conduct oral history interviews?
Well, the sad thing is that I went to Pakistan for a very short period of time. That's the only time I have visited in 2019 September. It was just a 6 day long visit. So I
Okay.
was barely able to, do much. I met Mr. Raza Kazim for uh, just like 2-3 hours,
Yeah.
and you can imagine in a 6 day period. And I had to go back last year, but COVID has completely thrown like water on those plans. Luckily, I got into contact with scholars in Lahore who have helped to kind of conduct a few interviews on my behalf, which is
Okay.
very nice.
Yeah.
That is the data I'm processing right now, but
Yeah.
I think it's difficult because I haven't conducted those interviews. And if I were to ask those questions to musicians in Pakistan as an Indian passport holder, I would get very different answers than
That's true. Yeah.
someone from Lahore is asking those
Yeah.
questions. I'm an outsider.
Yeah.
The only memory I have of Lahore is through my grandparents. So I think of Lahore as connected to me, but I'm still an outsider. I don't
Yeah.
understand things. So it's interesting how the person conducting the interview will also elicit the answers from the same person will give you different answers.
That's true. And I think I was reading Anindya Rai Chaudhary's book where he has sort of narrated the story of South Asian partition, and he was able to conduct interviews in Pakistan also.
Yeah.
And this is the point that he also mentioned, that I would get much more honest and, like sort of somewhat, straightforward answers when I was in India as opposed to when I was in Pakistan. Because even though I was not like he's a person of Indian origin, right? Like his name is a giveaway. So people would be sort of more careful in answering certain questions and they might not be supremely honest with you with,
Yes.
those answers.
And with good reason, because they may
Yeah,
not want to hurt you. And
absolutely.
it's hard to overcome, like not centuries, but decades of prejudice which you have grown up with. So
Yeah.
it's the dilemma, really. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's the other way around also. If a Pakistani, oral historian comes to India, it would be the same thing for them also.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Completely true. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So what else, were you able to like do in your 6-day visit to Pakistan? Did you conduct more oral interviews?
I was again. It was a. If you have only 6 days in
Yeah.
Lahore, what do you do? So
Yeah.
I was at the Lahore Museum, looking at the archives there, between and meeting people. More than anything else, I was just meeting people, uh, people who were interested in studying music, people who were teaching music. So I was just about able to meet people, and I think the 6 day visit happened as part of a larger team visit from the University of Sheffield. So it was easier for me to go as part of a larger group.
Yeah.
And the plan was always to return for a month or two to do proper interviews. But let's see if we can try
Yeah.
that next year.
Yeah. I mean, it's still more than a lot of people, sort of get because at least you were able to go to Pakistan, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Oh, great. We have a question here. So, Rao Qasim wants to know that the Marasi community in Pakistan, Punjab are mostly under the Qureshi name. Okay, okay. So, this is more of a comment. Uh,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, that I think there have been studies of the Mirasis in Pakistan, and there are different kind of caste names they would go by. Yeah, and I think there has been a recent attempt by some young Mirasi musicians to reclaim the term Mirasi as a positive trait.
yeah,
Sorry, my cat is going to disturb us. Sorry. So the song by Hassan Nawaz says, "मैं मिरासी, मेरा प्यो मिरासी, मेरा दादा मिरासी, ऐसा सारे मिरासी हैं." And that's interesting because he's saying we are all mirasis because the term miras is an Arabic term that means inheritance. So we all come with our own inheritance into the world. And so we all have certain knowledge that we inherit from our ancestors, and therefore we all are mirasis, which is really interesting because it's high time we don't associate this as a negative term, and this it's loaded with caste oppression in our
yeah,
society.
yeah, exactly. Okay, Adil G. Uddin says that not from Punjab myself, but there's a song from the movie Pinjar, Vatna Ve O Merya Vatna Ve. That voice was too deep and had a feeling of being wounded.
Right. Yes, I think this music of Pinjar was very, very evocative. So, yeah, there's.
Yeah. Rao Qasim has another question. Any thoughts on the Muslim Rajputs that migrated from East to West Punjab?
Um, I don't really know what to say about that because there were so many groups that migrated from east to west, and amongst musicians also, not all were Mirasis. Some of them were more elite. I don't think I can share anything special on the Muslim Rajputs, so I wouldn't try to be dishonest and say
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
Okay. Um, oh, okay. Rao Kasim says that I've met Hindu Rajputs in Canada who are surprised to find the numbers and influence of Muslim Rajputs in West Punjab. Any thoughts from your research on this?
Um, I think the same. Uh, I mean, the point is that I suppose people in India have forgotten the fact that, or people in Indian Punjab have forgotten that amongst Punjabi Muslims, some of these castes still, they still, the caste status persists even in Pakistan.
Yeah.
Uh, so it's very hard to marry outside the sort of Rajput caste. I met some friends who were from Pakistan, who are Punjabi Rajputs, and again there was this kind of pride in caste identity, which is just so, I mean, unbelievable that we still are stuck in these old paradigms.
Yeah.
And despite Islam being an egalitarian religion, caste has seeped
Yeah.
in. So
Yeah.
it's really
Yeah.
interesting. That's all I can say about it.
Yeah. That's true. Okay, we have another question from Anil Kapuria. A fellow Kapuria, we are known as Lahore Wale Kapuria. I feel Punjabis dominated Bollywood, and that has been more of a reason and not the partition.
Right. So
Um,
I mean more of a reason that we've forgotten about classical music.
yeah,
Uh, I would disagree. I think the Punjabis who've dominated Bollywood have also tried to assimilate into a larger Hindi-speaking cultural realm
yeah,
instead of perhaps revealing their Punjabi roots. Because in India it became masked with Hindi. In Pakistan, Punjabi, your proficiency in the Punjabi language and in music and other sort of cultural forms was not as valued as your knowledge in Urdu and English.
yeah,
Similarly, in Indian Punjab. So I think uh, Punjabis could have dominated Bollywood and also been proud of their classical heritage in Punjab, but that didn't happen. And
yeah,
uh, I'm saying, and others have also said, that this is probably because due to partition, we have forgotten this history of how Punjab and especially Lahore used to be a center of such important classical music.
yeah. That's true. So, did you also interview? I mean, this is something that I was wondering. So, did you interview somebody who's working in the film industry now, in the Punjabi film industry? You know?
I am yet to interview people in Indian Punjab. Uh,
Okay.
so that is something that is uh, pending. So that's something that would be very interesting to note as well.
Yeah.
But I think there are some people in the Pakistani film industry whom my friends in Lahore did interview. So I will be looking at those interviews.
Okay. So as far as India is concerned, let's talk about your oral history, like work that you've done in India. So if you could share something, like some anecdote from your experience doing that, it would be
Right.
wonderful. Yeah.
So the main ethnography or main set of interviews I've done in India have been in the city of Jalandhar. And this is because I started my research before my PhD on the music festival of Harvallabh, which is the oldest classical music festival of Hindustani music. It started in 1875, and it's the oldest extant festival. So the oldest festival that is still running.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And as part of this, I interviewed musicians in Jalandhar like Baldev Singh Narang, who tragically passed away earlier this year. I interviewed Mr. Gurdial Singh, who was a sitar maker and who used to have a shop in the old part of Jalandhar where he used to sell musical instruments. And he was someone who had also come from West Punjab to Jalandhar and had set up shop there. I think one of the most memorable interviews was with someone called Mohan Malsiani, who was a musical enthusiast and who was sitting at Gurdial Singh ji's shop in Jalandhar when I was interviewing Gurdial Singh. And Mohan Malsiani said, I was a young boy, and I remember how the father of Ustad Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan Sahab, father and Chacha, Mubarak Ali Fateh Ali, had come back to Jalandhar after partition to perform at the shrine of Imam Nasr, which is a big Sufi center in Jalandhar. And it was at the annual Urs that they came to perform Qawwali. And he says, I remember all of us were so excited that these two have come back after partition to perform again in our city. So I think, and he was a listener. He wasn't someone. He wasn't a professional musician or a instrument maker. But this is how when you just don't know when you will find an anecdote from a bystander.
Yeah.
And then in the archives, I found that this can be corroborated that they did in fact visit Jalandhar in 1952 to perform there, and the warmth and love with which the Hindus and Sikhs who remembered this from before partition, because Ustad Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan Saab's family, they were Pathans, but they were from the Pathan bastis of Jalandhar. So Jalandhar was a very major musical city pre-partition. It still is. But again, there was a lot of migration of Muslim musicians out of Jalandhar
Yeah.
in 47. So this was one of the most memorable stories I can think of right now. I'm sure there are a lot more.
Yeah. So Gary Singh asks that the harmonium shop in Jalandhar, is it still there?
I would have to check because the last time I visited Jalandhar was 2 years ago, and at that time I didn't go back to those shops. So I don't know if the particular shop you're referring to is still there. I think Gurdial Singh Ji's shop of the sitars and other musical instruments are still there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I was wondering that your book that's coming out soon, if you could talk about that a bit, and if you could talk, talk us through what all is there in that book, what all should we be looking forward to?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'll just quickly. I had a few slides on Madam Noor Jahan and how
Okay.
she was also so beloved in India after partition that.
Yeah.
So this is from the 1956 Times of India, and at the Filmfare Awards presentation, there was apparently they tried to get audiences to come to this awards presentation by saying Noor Jahan would be coming from Pakistan. I don't think that she actually managed to come, cross the border and come, but Morarji Desai was trying to ensure that she came and performed in Bombay. So there was this, this is like 9 years after partition, so people still remembered these artists from, and Noor Jahan was a big name in the Bombay film industry pre-partition. But we'll quickly go forward to the question on my book. My book is starting with Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who was the last sort of defense to British annexation. I mean, after he died, within 10 years, the Sikh Empire had dissolved, and the East India Company, or rather by then, had kind of taken over Punjab. And he was a big force to reckon with for the British. And my whole purpose in bringing him to the story of music is that he actually patronized and gave land grants and lots of help, like very big salaries to musicians and dancers. And that's an image of a sketch of dancers at his court on the bottom of the slide. And female dancers, especially courtesans, were very well looked after by him. They were a very wealthy class of performers. And he actually made a special troupe of dancers called the Amazons. Amazons is a term which refers to the Greek warriors from ancient Greece, Greek female warriors. This is a term that the British and European travelers to Ranjit Singh's court gave these dancers. It's not a term that Ranjit Singh gave himself.
Okay.
They were called Amazons because they dressed as men and they did martial dances before visitors. So, and they were throughout the end of his reign from 1831 to 1839, the last 8 years of his rule, they were an important part of state diplomatic negotiations with the British, with other people who visited his darbar. So that's the evidence I found in the archives. That's again a way to look at these groups which are hard to trace in the archives, but you find references to them. There were references to their names. So
Yeah.
names like Dhannu, Nabbo, Kola, or which is like Kamal in Punjabi, or Lotus. So these women were rather powerful. And with time, by the end of the 19th century, by 1890s, there was an attack on them from these anglicized, English educated, middle class Punjabis uh, who thought that these are women of poor repute, of
Yeah.
you know low moral character. So there was a whole Punjab Purity Association to abolish march. Um, and yet these women didn't die out overnight. They continued to be important. And so that's one of the stories that my book tells you. The second story is what happened to the Mirasis, how people learned music from the Mirasis. Even colonial scholar administrators
Hmm.
learned from the Mirasis. There was an interest in their music. And finally, I think I look at Patiala and Kapurthala, which is the princely states, and how they nourished musical traditions. And so the subtitle is From Pul Kanjri to Patiala. Pul Kanjri was the name of a monument in which is near the Wagah border today in Amritsar, and it was built by Maharaja Ranjit Singh for his wife, who was a Muslim courtesan. One of his wives was Bibi Mora, because she danced like a peacock, so Bibi Mora. And one day she was traveling to Ranjit Singh, and her silver slipper fell into the canal, in the Hasli Canal waters, the water that takes the canal that goes up to the Shalimar Gardens in Lahore. And she was very upset, and she said, I will never meet you or dance for you again unless you build a bridge for me. So he built this bridge called Pul Kanjri, or the Bridge of the Dancing Girl. And it's not just a bridge. Today you'll see there is an old mosque, an old Shiv temple, an old Gurdwara, and of course a sarovar or a talab at this bridge. So it's a monument which we have forgotten, much like the courtesans of Punjab. So that's the kind of story where I've tried to trace in the book, where female performers were very important in Punjab. Musical stars are not just men, but they were also women.
Yeah.
So
That's really interesting. And I think we have another question from Vivek Anand.
yeah.
So he says that he studied singing with Shekhawat Ali Khan, son of Salamat Ali Khan. Have you studied the Sham Chaurasi Gharana and its roots?
I've read about the Shamchurasi Gharana and its roots. There are many explanations. Some people say that it's Chaurasi Gaon, like there were some 84 villages that came together to kind of create this lineage. No, I don't have anything particular that I have researched about Shamchurasi, except for, of course, Ustad Salamat Ali and Nazakat Ali Khan, and how popular they were as young children. One of the first places that they performed in was Har Vallabh Musical Festival in Jalandhar, and at the Durgyana Mandir in Amritsar, where the holy music festival happens, the Lakshmi Narayan Rag Sabha. And these two brothers were one of the foremost who kept traveling back to India to perform. They were much loved by Indian Punjabi audiences too. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Vivek Anand, for the question. Uh, so, okay,
I'll just move my cat outside the room. She's going to disrupt the whole talk. I'm sorry.
but that's okay. Um, So, in the meantime, let me just tell you a bit about myself. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Hyderabad. And currently, I'm a Fulbright doctoral fellow visiting the Department of History at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And I've been involved with the 1947 Partition Archive since 2018. I'm a former story scholar with the archive, and I've contributed by interviewing more than 60 people in Hyderabad and Lucknow. And with that, we have Radha back on screen. So it's a legit question. We would also want to know, what is the name of your cat?
Well, my cat's called Squeaky, But if I could have chosen her name, I would have called her Malai because she's
Okay.
sweet as Malai. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very different name. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Anand J.K. Kalra says that he's amazed to hear about these Amazons. Okay. Mhm.
Yeah. So no, they were a really interesting group of women, and you can read more about it when my book is out, and I hope you'll
Sure.
read it. Yeah.
Yeah. So you said that like you did a lot of oral history interviews in Jalandhar. So other than Jalandhar, did you go to other cities of Punjab to do some interviews?
So I visited Patiala and Chandigarh,
Okay.
and as I think I did more libraries and archival research in Patiala because Patiala has the state archives from every princely state that has been in Punjab, and including Patiala. So again, I had to kind of choose between doing archives and interviews. So as a historian, I couldn't ignore the archives.
Yeah.
So that's where I did most of my archival research. Yes.
Okay. And so, what do you have to say in general about oral history? Like, how important do you think it is now for the field of history and for history writing and for sort of, like taking a different look at the existing, like historical literature that we have?
I think oral histories are such a treasure trove because the texture that you get in an oral narrative is very different from what you find in the archives or in that kind of source material. But with oral history, we have to always work with some kind of because memory is such a slippery thing, and often in when you're narrating things in oral history, so some small details can over time be either changed or you can imagine things a bit more differently than perhaps how they occurred. So that's both the power of oral history, and it's why it's so appealing, but it's
Mhm.
also a challenge because it's it's hard to look at broader historical trends and only based on oral history as well. So I think as historians we have to walk the line, and we
Yeah,
can't ignore either kind of source.
yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. That you're right about that. I mean, we always have to go back to the archive to sort of validate.
validate.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, and if not validate, if you can't validate and it's only there in the oral record, it doesn't mean it's not important. It
yeah,
means that it's really great that you have archived. So your oral history
yeah,
today becomes archive for a researcher tomorrow. And as an example to that, I would uh, share. I don't know if you can see my. I'll just share it again.
yeah.
I will share an interview that was done of Madam Noor Jahan uh, with Dilip Kumar, who recently
Wow.
passed away, the Indian Indian actor.
Yeah.
Um can we? I don't know if you can see my screen.
We can now.
You can, right?
Yeah.
So this is a poster of the film Jugnu from 1947, and I don't think there's time to play this song because it's
No, you. Oh no, you can. We surely do have some time. Yeah.
okay. Let me try
Yeah.
and play the. I think it's not playing. I'm sorry, I tried.
Okay. Okay. No problem.
So the song is "तुम भी भुला दो, हम भी भुला, मैं भी भुला दूं, प्यार
Mhm.
पुराने गुजरे ज़माने." And I think the fact that it was made in 47 and the fact that what was to come was not quite clear in the minds of people at this time, it's very poignant, this song. Maybe some people in the audience will remember watching this film. In 1983, she came back to India and did an interview on Doordarshan with Dilip Kumar. And it's a really beautiful interview. It's available on YouTube. And
Okay.
what she told him was so interesting. And about 47, she said, ऐसा नफसा नफसी का आलम था, कोई भी अपने बसे हुए घर को छोड़ के जाना पसंद नहीं करता, मेरे मेरे मियाँ गए तो मैं भी चली गई. And most importantly, she said, मेरी आवाज अमानत है, आवाम की अमानत है, यहाँ भी और वहाँ भी. So she kind of assigned custodianship of her voice to the public and the audience. And that's the larger issue that I'm very interested in seeing is how people love these musicians across borders, and there is a cultural citizenship that goes up beyond Pakistani or Indian citizenship, uh,
Yeah.
which is very strong, which is loaded with affect, which is loaded with emotional resonance. And yeah, so I think there is a lot of material already there, because many of these musicians who've been through partition are now no longer alive.
True.
And that's also a challenge. If I'm researching partition, in a couple of years, much of that generation would have died, and
Yeah.
we be actually looking at second generation memories. So memories of
That's
people
true.
from my parents' generation
Yeah.
who, who were indirectly affected by
Yeah.
partition. So yeah, I think there's so many ways that we can
Yeah.
do research. Yes.
Yeah. And thank you for, like letting us know about this amazing interview that is available on YouTube, right? Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
it is.
Okay. So we have another question from Khurram Iqbal. What's your impression of the book Freedom at Midnight?
I think you mean the book by Dominique Lapierre, and
I,
I think it's a very pulpy take on history. It's written in a very racy fashion, but
Mhm.
as a historian, I would not recommend it. There's so much
Yeah.
more on the Indian partition that you can read from.
Yeah.
It's written in a very raunchy manner. It's kind of, so it's, I would say that it's very entertaining, but please read a bit more and don't form your opinion just based on that book.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Thank you so much, Khurram Iqbal, for your question. And with that, I think we have come to an end of our conversation today. Radha, it was amazing having you, and like the things that you shared, the music that you played, the documentary links that you talked about in terms of like what's available on YouTube. I think it's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. It's really, really great to chat with you, Parul.
And I was thinking, like, when can we expect your book in the market now?
I think early next year.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
fingers
Wonderful.
crossed. Things, you know how it is with publishing, it
I
can take
know.
a really long time, but yeah,
I
hopefully
know. So, yeah. And
I'll
publishing
definitely
and
share
COVID.
it. I know, with both things, absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Radha. Before we end, I would just like to talk to the audience about the Partition Archive. So the 1947 Partition Archive documents the nearly lost oral histories of partition. Our flagship oral history project is the largest of its kind in South Asia, and so far, with great dedication and grit, we have documented almost 10,000 families' history in not just the Indian subcontinent but across the globe. And you can learn more about our work by visiting our website or by speaking to any of our team members. And like the last two seasons, we have a brilliant lineup of speakers once again. So spread the word and do not forget to hop on with us every Sunday. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Radha, for gracing our screen on a Sunday.
No, thank you for listening to me and for listening to all these stories. Hopefully, there'll be a lot more to report in a few months' time with more research. So, yes.
Yeah, wonderful. And next week, we'll have Hussein Zia Khan on our Sunday story. So just, like, don't forget to hop on with us. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you, Parul.